and bungalow. We think almost exclusively of the Western Front in terms of the distance from the Channel coast to the River Somme, and neglect everything to the west and south of there, quite apart from what happened on other fronts and to other countries. And so how should we tackle 2040 in terms which actually have greater purchase for us and help us lift our vision? A great deal is happening across this country that is to be understood in local terms. And what is happening right here in Gretna is a manifestation of that. And that is wonderful. I mean, the degree of engagement with the centenary is something that has come, dare I say it, in a phrase David Cameron did actually use at one point in relation to the centenary, but I'd like to say he's not using it anymore. But it did come in the sense that it was a big society moment. It was happening because people across the country felt it was important it should happen. And of course, what people have very often concentrated on has been on their war memorials. Who are the names on their war memorials? And they can be pretty surprising. I had an email 2 weeks ago from a guy in a village in Hampshire saying, are you the great nephew of 2nd Lieutenant E.S. Strachan? And I said, yes, I am. And he said, well, it's on our village war memorial. And I said, I haven't the foggiest idea how he can possibly be on your village war memorial. I have no connection between my family and your village. And he said, well, nor do we know why he's there. So, you know, there is a way in which this local knowledge can come and hit you slightly sideways. And I still don't know. He was killed at Loos, my great-uncle Stanley, and my grandfather was wounded in the same year in 1915, serving with the London Scottish. But as far as I know, their father had moved from Perth to London. They had both joined, they both brought up in London. So why he's on that memorial, I don't know. I'm looking forward to finding out. But the point about that local engagement is, what opportunity does it give us to ask big questions about the war as a whole? And if you think what you're doing here in Gretna, you can begin to realize how much potential there is. Because, of course, Gretna immediately takes you not to the Western Front in quite the way you might imagine, but raises a whole lot of other issues. First of all, the train disaster. Where are those troops going to? 7th Royal Scots. They're going to Gallipoli. They're not going to the Western Front. So this is a war about many fronts and not just the Western Front. Second, what happens here in Gretna itself immediately makes us realize that this is not a war fought just by soldiers who join the army, but it's a war, of course, that involves the mobilization of women and involves people who are working on the factory floor as much as those who put on a khaki uniform. And I hope one of the consequences, if you don't have the privilege of having as close a First World War heritage as Gretna does, is that people will begin to realize that actually the diversity of First World War experience was as great as those who were worried about this in the 1920s knew it was. In other words, it may be that, number one, of course, you come from Gretna, but your forebear, precisely because you're here, almost certainly came home again. Survived. Second, that you may have a family member who served in the armed forces but never went near the Western Front. Or who didn't serve in the armed forces but served in the merchant navy, or was in the fishing fleet, or was a clerk in the war office, or, crucially, was in the business of industry, munitions production, and so on. So, what a local approach can give you is a door that opens out into the much wider global significance of this war. That, in other words, you can move from the macro to the micro through local studies. And with 4 years of the centenary, we have the opportunity to do that. The second thing I think this centenary can do is to think about how we see this war, the First World War, now, as opposed to how they might have seen it in 1928 or 1964. And here we need to reflect on what war means for us in our generation, as opposed to what it meant then. The end of 2014, British troops are coming back from Afghanistan. It is heralded as a moment when, for the first time for almost a decade, we won't have troops actively engaged in overseas theatres of war. But of course, those wars, both Iraq and Afghanistan, have become deeply ambivalent for us. Wars which we see as potentially lost, although I have to say one of the good news things is the election in Afghanistan suggests that things may be looking more positive there in terms of a successful political outcome than many of the doom merchants suggested was possible. But wars that we've had our doubts about. And I think here the First World War carries a message for us, because the Second World War has been so cast as the good war, the unequivocally justified war, that it's no use to us in terms of understanding the moral dilemmas that war presents for us. We now see the Second World War as necessary because it was to defeat a truly evil regime that was perpetrating one of the greatest atrocities in human history in the shape of the Holocaust. But of course that isn't why we got into the First World War in 1939. We got into the First World War in 1939 for almost identical reasons we got into the Second World War in 1939, for almost the same reasons we got into the First World War in 1914. That is to say, we got involved in the affairs of a country far away from us on the other side of Europe, and we were concerned about the balance of power within Europe. We were not out there in 1939 to save the Jews, or indeed to defeat Nazism as an ideology. It became that through the course of the war. But one of the consequences, of course, of the Second World War having become unequivocally the good war, the war that can be seen as a victory, the war in which losses are seen as justified, and nobody argues, is that, of course, the First World War has become even more the bad war, the irredeemably awful war, the war that we can't understand, the war that is incomprehensible, the war that is futile and wasteful. And if we realise that in 1914, the cabinet of this country, with a week to go to Britain's entry to the war, was divided just about 50-50 on the wisdom of entering this war. If we realise how divided this country potentially was about the entry to the war, then I think we can realise something that is of relevance to us. Because what it raises for us is, when is it justified to go to war? Coming back to those last letters, when is the point that actually it is right to go to war? And most people in 1914 in Britain did think it was right to go to war. And does that carry purchase for us today? And secondly, when is it right to go on fighting despite the fact that you are suffering losses and you don't seem to be getting any closer to the outcome? We've asked that question many times in the last 10 years in relation to Iraq and Afghanistan. In the winter of 1916, there was a peace initiative. There were actually two peace initiatives, one initiated by Germany and the second picked up by Woodrow Wilson, by the President of the United States. And Wilson asked each of the belligerent countries for the terms on which they would make peace. And this is of countries that know what this war is like. This is not an anticipated war. They've just had Verdun, they've just had the Somme. And what comes back to him is, from Britain, we will not settle terms without the restoration of Belgium's integrity. That's what we went to war for. That must be there. And for France, which did not go to war to recover Alsace-Lorraine, but having got into the war, certainly wasn't going to end it without getting Alsace-Lorraine back, they say, we will not agree terms without giving up Alsace-Lorraine. From Germany, the note comes back saying, well, the two things we certainly won't give up are Belgium and Alsace-Lorraine. So there is no scope for negotiation. And Wilson realises that. 2 years into the war, that the war is deemed still to be sufficiently about big issues for it to be fought through. And that is a question we've asked ourselves in the course of 2002, 2003 to 2014. So one of the things I think we can do with this war, as we go into the centenary, is ask the big questions about war and peace, especially as we begin to reflect on a moment when we think this country is unlikely to go to war in the immediate future, precisely because of the experience of the last 10 years. Let's just put some context on that. We have 4 years of this centenary. It's going to be an awfully long time. I have no idea where we'll all be by that. I know I'm already feeling exhausted by it. Attrition does operate. But if we don't come out with that, without a better understanding of the war itself, and, independently of that, a better understanding of war as a phenomenon, then we will have missed out. Thank you very much.